Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
One of the things that I love about being involved in the Ideas Hour is the way that it makes connections across conversations, across events, and across thinking. And today's programme is full of connections. I first came across our guest, Mary Michel, while working on a creative conversation about COP26. So we have an immediate link to the conversations that we've had and are planning about the climate crisis. Mary links that with ideas about economics and takes on into the creativity aspect that we've explored in other programs. They're all huge themes for us here on Teacher Hug Radio.
And Mary is a wonderful guest in terms of connections. Her academic background is in the philosophy of sustainable thinking. She's served as director of the Incorporation of Goldsmiths, which includes responsibility for all the ethical sourcing and educational programs, as well as vice chair of Craft Scotland, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is Scotland's national agency for craft. In 2016, she co-founded Ostrero with her colleague Marion Brown with the aim of growing the circular economy in Scotland through mindset change. She's particularly interested in how we can change people to move them toward a circular economy. I am really excited to talk about this. So, Mary, let me begin by saying welcome to the Ideas Hour.
Hi, Suzanne. Hi, David. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think there are lots of really meaty ideas to get to grips with, and I'm looking forward to going over them with you.
Fantastic. Then can we just start by, Mary, can you tell people what a circular economy is?
Absolutely. So a circular economy is all about keeping things at their highest value for as long as possible. So in our current economy, we take things out of the ground, we make things with them, we use them, and we chuck them away without worrying too much about where they end up. So it's very much a straight line. In a circular economy, we'd be thinking about the whole life cycle of everything that we design, make, and use. And we'd be keeping those materials and resources in the cycle for as long as possible. So there's much, much less waste. And essentially, it means that we can have an economy where we keep resources going for much longer than we do in our current economy. So it's a really great practical framework for cutting out waste and then for cutting out lots and lots of the issues that cause climate change.
I love that, Mary. And clearly we're talking about ideas in the plural here. We're talking about economics. We're talking about all sorts of things. One of the things I'm struck by is that so much of what we consider to be a modern economy is actually built-in obsolescence that we drive. You know, I don't want to name check, but there is a well-known computer company called After a Fruit. And you're guaranteed that if you buy a new phone from that company, you probably need a new charger because the old charger won't do. And you probably also need a new attachment for your headphones. How do we get companies like that to move away from that kind of built-in obsolescence?
Well, I think it has to come from two places. I think it has to come from public pressure. So the customers saying, I don't want any more of this. I don't want a phone that I have to replace every year. I don't want all of this tech. I think we all have bags or boxes full of chargers and bits of phones and bits of computers in our houses that we don't know what to do with. I know that I certainly do. So I think one side has to come from public pressure and the customers saying, that's enough, I don't want it anymore. And the other side, I think, has to come top down from government legislation. This is happening a lot more in the EU right now. There's a bill going through about the right to repair. So they have to design and make new products that can be repaired. And that's a really key element of the circular economy. I know, I don't know if we're allowed to give product names on this, but actually this is one of the things we often talk about in schools when we work in schools, is around how you might design a product differently. So I use a phone called a Fairphone, and it's a small Dutch company that's set up with the sole aim of making a phone that lasts. So that sounds really basic. It sounds like it's not rocket science, but actually that's the opposite of how almost all other phone companies currently work. So they design a phone that will last for as long as possible. They design a phone that's really easy to take apart so that you can fix bits. They design a phone that can be updated. So say you break your camera, or the camera just isn't good enough and you want to update to the next model, you can just update that bit rather than chucking the whole phone away and getting a new one. And when they send it to you, they send you little screwdrivers and a little screwdriver and some screws, and they tell you how you can do that. It's really easy to do. So actually redesigning things and getting rid of that built-in and planned obsolescence is actually quite simple to do. And the really exciting thing about them was when they first set up, they were told, your idea can't work because it's not based on selling enough product. So your company just isn't going to work. But what happened was that they got so many customers who were fed up of all this planned and built-in obsolescence. So they've actually got a huge customer base. They're doing really well. So it shows that there is a public feeling of wanting change and being ready to show they want that change through the choices they make and what they buy.
Mary, that's a great example of how a circular economy applies to products. And that's a good place to start because it gives people a really clear, concrete vision of what a circular economy might give us. Can we go broad for a minute? Why else do you think your idea matters right now?
Yeah. So our idea is that the circular economy provides a really practical framework for tackling climate change. And our idea specific to Ostrero is that in order to get there, we need to change mindsets, and we need to change them in a way that people really want to get on board with. So rather than having reports full of statistics or jargon, or a lot of the things we read in the press at the moment are quite anxiety inducing about climate change. So it often stops people from acting. What we want to do is get people to learn about it and to go through that process of mindset change through a really creative learning process. So rather than being told this is what you have to do, really absorbing the information through the act of designing, making, creating things for themselves in a collaborative process with other people, whether that's in a school or a business or a cultural organization. We can all do that. So we can all get to that moment of mindset change, moving towards a circular economy through this really enjoyable, creative learning process. And I think it really matters at the moment now. I mean, we've all followed, I think, the conversations around COP26 and around the climate crisis, around pollution, around the fact that this is happening here and it's happening now. It's no longer a problem for the future or a problem for the far away. In addition to the huge problems around climate change, there is this massive problem in our current economic system around the amount of waste that we have. So we're all encouraged to buy more and more stuff. And just like David was just asking about, the system encourages us to buy lots of things we don't actually need. And obsolescence is built into the products. This means we use loads and loads of resources that we don't really need to use. So resources are getting harder to extract and rarer because we're overusing them. And in fact, Friends of the Earth estimate that globally, each year, we're using the resources of 2 planets rather than 1, just under 2 planets. And if you extrapolate those figures to Scotland, we're using the equivalent of 3 planets. So we're using 3 times as many resources in Scotland each year as we actually have, as much as the planet can sustain. So we really need to think about how can we use our resources differently. In addition to that, you've got 3 billion new people coming into the planet in the next 30 years. So that's a huge figure, lots more people who are all going to be wanting to use things in the way that we do. So how can we share out those dwindling resources more fairly, so there's enough to go around now, and also to make sure there's enough going forward in the future? So I think that's a really important reason for why this matters now. We're really beginning to understand the impact of our current economic system and the huge amount of really needless waste that there is in there. One example that we often use is around cars. So if you ask in a school or a business or any kind of organization, put your hands up if you have a car, you'll probably find 8 out of 10 people have a car in their family. But most cars sit unused 92% of the time. So we put all these resources, energy, human ingenuity into creating this really fantastic object. And then it just sits outside our car, outside our home or our school or our office, just unused. So in a circular economy, you'd think about how could you use that object differently? Might you have a car club where everybody shares the service of a car rather than every family or every household owning a car? So yeah, thinking about resources, thinking about the growing population, thinking about how you can plan things more fairly so that there's enough to go around are all key reasons for thinking about this idea now. I also think that COP's really brought out the climate anxiety that so many people are feeling, and especially young people. There was a recent survey in The Lancet, and it asked questions of 100,000 young people aged 16 to 25, I think, over lots of different countries about how they felt about climate change. And the overwhelming majority said they felt frightened and anxious. And 39% of them said they would really consider seriously whether they should have a child because of the climate crisis. So you think we're in a world where over a third of young people are unsure about bringing more young people into the world. I think that's a frightening figure and a frightening place for our young people to be. So I think that's why this work is really, really important right now.
Mary, that's a really powerful example that young people are scared to think about having children, or are just deciding not to have children, not even from a place of fear, but from pragmatics. Could you just give us a couple more examples from your own experience? So if that's a broad figure about what's happening with young people, can you give us a couple of examples from your experience of what you hear in working with young people in Scottish schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with children from primary 3, so they're about 7, up to S2, which is about 15, give or take. And the good news in that is that we found that young people are so open to these new ideas in a way that we don't find when we give the same kind of creative learning workshops about the circular economy in businesses or organizations. And I think that's because young people still have, their minds are still open. So they're not so fixed into this is our current economic system, it must happen like that. So the good news is they're really, really open to it. And this whole idea of fairness and making sure we use our resources more carefully and more fairly just absolutely resonates with children. But we do hear a lot of kind of worry. And I think the younger children, especially primary, their main worry seems to be about wildlife and animals. So again, there's been a huge loss of biodiversity in the last century. We're seeing that all the time, and there are so many stories from all over the world about that happening. And I think that's something that really worries children. So we asked children what they thought world leaders should prioritise at COP26 in an online display that we did with the National Museums of Scotland. And we found that the answers came out in sort of 3 main sections. So wildlife and biodiversity were the top one. That's what children really worried about. And then the kind of design and disposal of products. So they worried about stuff being chucked out when it shouldn't be chucked out. And some of them came up with inventions for kind of trawling the sea to get all the rubbish out of it. But that idea of the life cycle of a product was something that came up in children's consciousness. And then energy, how we get our energy and how we could do that better and move to renewable energy sources was something that was very much uppermost in children's minds. But I also know actually from my own children, when you talked about that pragmatic sense, Suzanne, or that pragmatic response to it, that's kind of what I find quite sad, is that I see in my own children and in children that we work with this sort of acceptance that, yeah, the world's going to be really different. There'll be much fewer interesting animals and plants and insect life than there is just now. That the whole climate is going to change and the impacts that have, and they just accept that that's what's going to happen, which I think is really sad, and where we need to give them the skills and give them the kind of energy and the feeling that they can do something about it. So I think it's about overcoming that anxiety and that sense almost of lethargy or paralysis or powerlessness, and give them the skills that they need to be able to say, actually, we can do something about this, and we can start doing it right now in our school or in our home or in our community, with small steps, but having a vision of the bigger picture at the same time.
That's a brilliant illustration, Mary, of why we wanted you in the program. I mean, there's lots of people around who are big thinkers, if you like, about circular economy and related ideas. We've got Kate Rayworth and the Donut Economy. Her book's been a big seller. She's been massively influential. We've had the work of Ellen MacArthur and her foundation. And again, another superb example of somebody using the status and celebrity that they have to do good, something I think we need more of. But the reason we wanted you, as you've demonstrated, is you're doing the work. You're taking action and you're doing it on the ground, and you've talked about the work that you do with schools, but maybe we haven't given you enough time just to say what that work is. So tell us about what it is that you do with schools to try and take all of these ideas forward and have that impact.
Great, thank you, David. And I have to say, on that note, Ellen MacArthur is my total circular economy hero. I heard her talking on the radio in the middle of the night, and she was one of the key reasons that we set Ostrero up. She was just so inspirational. So I think she's wonderful, and the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation does is really great, and a really good resource for people to go to if you're looking for more information about circular economy. Yeah, so the work that we do in schools, we started in 2018, and the reason we started it was because we saw this gap. We saw that the circular economy can offer a really good response to climate change. And it's such a great way to approach a really, really complex problem. But we saw that there was very little information about that trickling down in a way that people could actually understand. So you've got quite high level academic reports on it, but very little just speaking in plain language. And actually it is quite easy to understand if you can talk about it in plain language. So we decided that education was where we wanted to start. We wanted to focus on schools. And in my previous work, I'd done a lot of creative learning, working with designers and makers. And I just think it's such a good way to learn about things. So instead of somebody standing up and talking at you, telling you what you should do, you yourself, through the act of drawing, designing, making, are learning about something, maybe without even really being aware of what you're learning. So what we do is we run half-day workshops called Making Circles. We always work with a professional designer maker, and because I'm totally hopeless at finding the actual handmade response to things, and they are so great at finding solutions to difficult things. We take in loads of really interesting materials into the schools. So they're all waste materials, but they're not milk bottles or cereal cartons or recycling, because we want people to stop thinking about recycling. Recycling is end of life palliative care, and it shouldn't even be happening at all. We want to redesign things right from the beginning and think you can actually design all that waste out. And in fact, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimate that if you go in at the design stage, you could design out 80% of the waste that exists in our current system. So just by changing how people think about design, you could cut out so much waste. So we take in really gorgeous things like fabric bolts from woolen factories that are at the end of the line. So maybe it's last year's colours, last year's patterns. We take in things like, we had a whole series of black neoprene circles, and they were the faces from wetsuits. So in a wetsuit factory, you've got to cut out the hole for the face, and then you're left with a circle of neoprene. And actually they're brilliant. They're really tough, waterproof, stretchy stuff, brilliant for making things with. So the idea is we wanted to tell the story of how much waste there is in our current system through these really nice materials. And then the children were not allowed to fix anything together with glue or sellotape, because we wanted them to think about how you could design things to be taken apart again so that you could fix them, repair them, update them. So we came up with lots of interesting ways, or I should say that mostly the designer makers came up with lots of interesting ways for how we can fix stuff together. So one of the things that we find that learners really love in these workshops is the opportunity to make lots of holes in things with bradles or scissors or needles or hammers, or we've got all these different tools they can use, which they absolutely love using. But the whole point is whatever they make, you can take apart again and use the materials and all the fixings again. So they work in groups to design something on these circular principles of transforming waste to value, designing for disassembly so that it can be repaired, thinking about renewable energy, all sorts of things like that. And they have to incorporate that into their design, and then they make a prototype using these materials and these fixings. So we've had things like bags, rucksacks that can change with the grower. So it might be something that You can change the decorations on. So if you're wearing a different outfit, you change the decorations rather than having different bags. It might be a bag with adjustable straps so that as the child grows, the bag grows with them. It might be something like some goggles to look up into space. So they were allowed to make anything they wanted. We didn't want it to be prescriptive. We had one group that made a gerbil trampoline for their gerbils, and modular design. So they'd bring the gerbil along in a little tube, put them on the trampoline. So we had all kinds of things, but all of them used this circular design process. And then at the end of each session, the groups would present what they'd done, and then we would discuss with them some really practical steps they could take in school for cutting out waste. So we thought about the big picture of designing differently, and then we brought it right back down to the small picture of, okay, what could you do today? So maybe thinking about how much packaging you have in your packed lunch, or maybe thinking about having a shared Halloween costume library at school so that everyone doesn't have to go out and buy a new outfit every year, but you could just share the ones across the school. So really simple ideas like that. So the idea is, I found often I would go to a conference or a talk or something, and I'd be really inspired by the speaker, and I think, oh, I've got to do something about this. Then I'd go home and I would have no idea where to start. And then I would just go back to my normal life and forget about how inspired I'd been, because there'd been no carry through from the talk or from what I'd heard. So what we were really keen to do was to inspire them, but then also just give them some things they could actually go home and start doing straight away. So that's what we do in Making Circles. And we do similar ones for organizations and businesses. And the main aim is just to inspire people about moving towards a circular economy, and then to get them actually doing it for themselves.
And Mary, are you able to track the long-term impacts of what you're doing? Are you able to do that? How?
So we do it anecdotally. I have to say, we don't have a formal tracking system in place. And one of the reasons for that is we can only work year on year, because we have to raise the funding to do this. So it means it's really hard to say, right, over 3 years we'll do this and we'll go back. But what we did do year on year was we would go into the school and work with them. And at the end of each year, we have a display with the National Museum of Scotland. So we've done 3 so far. And for that, we'd go back to the schools and ask them specific questions to feed into the display, which allowed us to see whether the children, or how much they had understood about the circular economy, and to kind of harvest their responses. So we had different themes for the exhibitions, but one was specifically on circular design. And then we did one during lockdown about building back better. So we asked children, right, we're in this awful place of lockdown, but are there any good things that you've seen that you would like to keep after lockdown that could help us move towards a fairer and environmentally better society? And that was really great, because you could see it would be several months after we'd done the workshop, but the children, who were all at this point at home and sending responses in, so you could tell they weren't too influenced by the teachers, it was really their own thoughts, came up with lots of really lovely things around kind of using technology better, so being able to speak to family members abroad much more easily, have better connection through technology rather than having to travel. Less pollution was a really big one, everyone being able to get out and have fresh air and enjoy less pollution, more animals coming in, those animals coming up again, more animals coming into cities, and seeing deer or buzzards and things right in the city centre. So that was a way of seeing how much of that information had kind of stayed part of their thinking. And we then this year we did one on COP26 and what children thought world leaders should prioritise at COP26. So again, we worked with them, but then doing the display was a way of going back and saying, okay, now tell us what you think is really important, most important for world leaders to be thinking about. But we don't yet have a formal tracking system, and that's definitely something that we would like to put in place.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about what you do, Mary, which I really like, is the way that you bring together so many different aspects that teachers and schools are encouraged to cover. So there's preparation for work in there. You're allowing young people to explore ideas about what they might do professionally, what they might do in their own lives. So you're covering what we talk about in Scotland as developing the young workforce. You might talk about it as careers education elsewhere. You've got in that element of learning for sustainability. You've got in the idea of creativity. So there are a huge number of things. And one of the things that really worries me in schools is that they're bombarded with initiatives. I always remember somebody, when I was doing development work, saying to me, for God's sake, you're wanting me to do creativity now. You just asked me to do the curriculum. And I said, well, actually, there's a link. And in another 6 months, I'll be back talking about developing the young workforce. People just feel bombarded by that. And at the core of all of it is the pressure that's on schools to address young people's attainment. Is there any element within the work that you do that you feel really helps them to develop in terms of these fundamentals of reading and writing and oracy and speaking better?
Yes, absolutely. And we were really lucky to have two really fantastic teachers we set up a steering committee to make sure this was fit for purpose. And having teachers on that committee meant that we were able to design the workshops in such a way that they really would be relevant and helpful, because that was exactly the point that you just made, David, was exactly the point they made. Oh, we get asked to do these things all the time, and it can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. So how could we design it in such a way that the teacher would think, oh, great, this is actually covering a lot of the outcomes that I need to cover, but also be really engaging and enjoyable for the learners. So yeah, we thought a lot about how to do that. One of the main skills that we incorporate into it is the actual physical making, using hand skills, which is really something that we see being lost. So both in my work with Ostrero, but also my previous work, we would do creative learning workshops, and we'd see 17-year-olds who couldn't tie a bow. They'd never had to tie a shoelace. Most people couldn't sew, couldn't thread a needle. You've got primary sevens who can't hold a pair of scissors. And just at the time that we were creating this or designing these workshops, there was a report that came out from the Edge Foundation. And they had the head of surgery at Imperial College in London, who was called Professor Kneebone, which I thought was a very apt name for the head of surgery. And he said, I'm getting these brilliant students coming into my surgery course, top academic marks, they're absolutely brilliant, but they can't cut in a straight line and they can't thread a needle. So there was this whole report which really kind of influenced our thinking around, this is a really missing piece in schools. And linked to that, the fact that the ability to repair, to understand how things are made, the ability to be able to fix things is going to be all the more important in a circular economy, where we don't want to be running up to the shopping mall to buy a new pair of leggings. We want to be able to just actually fix that hole ourselves. So that hand skills was absolutely key. But then you've also got the design element where they're drawing, they have to make presentation posters of their design, and at the end, the presenting of their ideas. So being able to present their ideas in a way that was engaging and interesting to other people is all part of how the workshops were designed, and thinking through how that fits in. So in Scotland, with the curriculum for excellence and the outcomes and the 4 capacities, was all part of how we designed the workshops.
It sounds brilliant. I'm going to guess most people go, it sounds brilliant. Okay, can we move into a bit of controversy?
Please do.
How come it is so hard for us to think at a bigger level and to push these ideas? So let me give a couple examples. How come it is so hard for us at a systemic educational level to think about physical development, which is cutting with scissors? And why is it we prioritize all the academic stuff and we can't see the wider implications? How come it is so hard to get, supermarkets to think about this? So I'm thinking, as we're talking, that last night I went to the supermarket and I love baby carrots. And so I wanted to purchase a pack of baby carrots, but it came with extra plastic. So I chose not to purchase the baby carrots, and I got the bigger carrots because it came with less plastic. I explicitly did that. But the supermarket doesn't know I made that decision. The only way they can know that is if a lot of other people make that decision and they tot up their purchases. I have no idea if they know that, and I didn't tell anybody. Okay, how come they need me to tell them that? Why can't they work that out for themselves? Why can't the education system work out that we need to do more on physical development? So those are really big level questions, but they're the same kind of question. How do we make change, and where is the resistance?
Yeah, I think that is some huge questions, and they're absolutely at the heart of what we're thinking about. And I think the main thing is, how do you get people to make the connection between our small daily gestures, so your buying of carrots, with the fate of the planet? Because it's so disconnected right now. And I think that part of that has come from the education system that's not fit for purpose. I think in Scotland, we're really lucky that the Curriculum for Excellence does something about this. But generally, the way that our children are educated is based on ideas from 100 years ago. Everything's put into strict subjects. There's silos. You have to do social studies on one hand and you do business on the other, and there's no link between the two. So you don't see, if I run a business that makes a lot of profit, that has an impact on what's happening in social studies. You learn things in separate silos. And I think that brings out people that think in silos and that are unable to make those connections between their daily gestures and what's happening to the planet. I think we're really lucky in the Curriculum for Excellence that some of those silos are broken down, that there is more cross-curricular learning and a more an approach that does allow for that connections to be made between ideas that might seem to be totally unconnected or disparate. But I think it's the key thing that we need young people to be learning about, to think, yeah, if I buy these carrots here, that's having an impact on a river over there, or on some migrant labourers who are not being properly paid over there, that all of these things are connected. But I think it's really, really difficult to do that in a global supply chain, because this supply chains are so complex. And all of us, I find this when I go shopping all the time, you want to think about one thing, you might think about plastic, but then how do you think about the environmental impacts of what you're eating? Or how do you think about the social justice impacts of what you're eating? The picture is so complex because we're in a global supply chain. And as an individual consumer, you can't possibly hope to go in and be able to unpick all that with each choice. So we each just have to do the best that we can. But I think there is a reluctance to think about some of these things. And I think some of that comes from fear of change, and fear that we don't have the right solutions. So let's just keep what we're doing. We know it's not working, but let's just keep at it. And I think there's some apathy, which is very much fed into by the current economic system that we live in. So I was thinking, over COP26, we had the government starting to say, we need to take action over climate change. But on the other hand, the much stronger hand, they're saying, you need to consume more, you need to grow, we need to keep businesses going, you must go out and consume more. So, and the two, I don't think, are compatible. We can't have infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. It can't happen. We can't just keep buying more and more things and hope that the other end will sort itself out, or take small environmental actions, but at the same time just be consuming a lot of stuff that we don't actually need. So I think there's a huge system change that needs to happen, where we knit all those things back together, and we really do re-establish that relationship between what you and I do when we go out to the supermarket or buy, I don't know, a pen. I've got a pen in my hand, I've got a glass here, to understand how those things are designed, how they're made, how we use them. So in a circular economy, we would think a lot about sharing some things rather than needing to own everything all the time. So that could be a car club or a tool library. And it just makes so much sense. It means that things are properly used. It means that you don't have to have space to look after them. It means you get the most up-to-date tool or car. You don't have to keep the same one for 15 years. And it means that we produce much less stuff. But of course, that is in opposition to our current economic system, which is predicated on more and more growth. So there is a big tension there. And it's a tension that needs to be resolved. And I'm a trustee at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland. And it's a really great organisation that thinks about all of these things and thinks about how could we structure an economy that is different from the one we're in just now, where we're going after growth at all costs, and think about how we could structure an economy that's good for people and planet, rather than just more and bigger all the time.
It's great to have a circular conversation about the circular economy, because what we've managed to do is go directly back to the very first introduction, where we talked about the ideas there being about connections. And an awful lot of what you talked about was that ability to make connections, for people to see how things are linked. There's a real debate in education between people that normally referred to as traditionalists, who talk about a knowledge base and how important the knowledge base is, and knowledge is the Velcro for joining everything together. And, you know, Amanda Spielman, the chief inspector in Ofsted in England, saying that some schools in England during lockdown had neglected the curriculum because they were too busy feeding kids. You know, and obviously every child offered a choice between a sandwich and a deep knowledge of the Tudors is going to demand that deep knowledge of the Tudors. But it's the failure to make connections that if the kid's hungry, you know, in 1906, in the lead up to the Liberal budget of 1906, where they brought in support for school meals for the first time ever in this country, there was a cartoon then of two kids standing looking at their teacher saying, "Mayn't I have something to eat first? I can't think for the hunger." And it's that whole idea about that failure to make connections and that failure to enable people to make connections. And that's what I think we need to highlight, Mary, in your work, is that children are writing, they are reading, they are acquiring vocabulary. You've used more statistics already in this program than any other guest we've had. So there's a lot of numeracy running through this. And it's the idea, it's the power of that package that delivers knowledge, delivers understanding, delivers basic skills and higher order skills together. I think that's where we need to go in education. And I think that's where you're taking us. Do you want to comment further on that?
Thank you. Yes, I do. And I think what you just said about the Ofsted inspector is really interesting. That worry that if children aren't attaining these grades or levels that we expect them to get to, that's the catastrophe. And I think that all comes down to value, this idea that we need to measure, test, examine, and then put a value on a person at a really, really young age. And I think that's part of where we're going wrong, and where part of the problem is at the moment is, what do we value and why? And this very much came out during COVID-19, didn't it? And this fact that the members of society that we valued the most during COVID, the carers, the bin men, the people that worked in supermarkets, are the people that are valued least by society, in the fact that they're paid the least and sort of looked after the least and valued in every way the least, but actually they're absolutely intrinsic to us running as a society. So I think that whole question around value and trying to quantify and value people is a big problem in our current system. And I would like to think that in a circular economy or a well-being economy, you're thinking about something that's much more fluid. You're not thinking about saying, right, this person is worth X because they do Y. You're saying this is what they contribute to society, this is what we give back, that we're all part of something much more fluid that is interconnected, recognizing the connections between what people can bring and the impact that they have. So often at the moment, the businesses that are the most valued are actually doing the most harm to the environment. And that's crazy. So we're living in a world where we value things highly that are actually having a really bad impact. So how can we swap all of that around? We're doing a bit of work at the moment as part of a Creative Horizons project with Edinburgh Uni and Edinburgh Napier Uni. And it's called the Creative Coin. And we're thinking about how could you incentivize people in the creative industries to adopt a more circular economy. And that whole question of value is central to that. So we're thinking, how can you put value on good actions that people take? So if people are doing things that are really good for the environment, that are good for other people, good for social justice, how can they be incentivized or rewarded for doing that? Rather than, at the moment, if people want to do things that are good for the environment, it tends to cost them money and time, and it can be difficult to do. So you find that people will do it, but it's kind of at their own cost. They're not rewarded for doing that. So we're looking at how could you incentivize people, show them the best way to go towards a circular economy, and then reward them for doing that in a way that's currently not valued in our current system. I'm aware that was a very rambly answer that went from here to there and back again. But these connections can seem to be really disparate, but it does all knit back in together, I think.
Yeah. Mary, circular answers, circular conversations, circular economy. It's just all about going round. I do think one of the things that we don't do, and this isn't a question, but it's just an observation from me, we are so unimaginative about what and how we assess in schools. It is possible to attribute value to some of these important ideas by asking about them. There's absolutely nothing wrong, in geography, for example, of getting children to demonstrate that they understand the relationship between place and people and environment, rather than simply naming and showing knowledge. And geography's come, I think, a long way towards that. But the idea of asking children to demonstrate an understanding of circumstances in a country that they haven't studied would still be perceived as radical. And as you say, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create young people who are imaginative, who will bring new solutions, and who will bring a different sense of values. But, going back to your other wonderful theme about trampolines for gerbils, I think what you're doing is providing us with loads of trampolines that can bounce us into different conversations. And I'm just dying to see which trampoline Suzanne's going to bounce on now.
Well, can I just, that's the best thing anyone's ever said about our work. Thank you. In relation to the trampolines, I read recently an article by Rebecca Solnit, who I think is great, and it was about 10 things you can do around climate change, and 2 of them for me were really strong. And the first one was imagination is a superpower, and the second one was don't neglect beauty. And I think both of those things are just key to what we should be teaching children, and key to them caring enough about the environment to want to do something about it. And I think, the way that our current system works is encouraging us all to go out and just consume more, whether it's consuming more clothes or objects or more social media or more TV. We are all encouraged to get into this slightly procedural way of living where we get into something and we just consume more and more, and we don't really look up and think, gosh, what's around us? What can I do? What's my impact in this world? So I think anything that gets children thinking, looking up and seeing the world around them and appreciating it and loving it and seeing that beauty, don't neglect that beauty, and seeing that they can have the imagination to come up with responses to that. And that's not to say we should put all the weight on them and say, because there is a train of thought around, right? The young people can find the solutions, and they're the next generation, they can fix what we've broken. It's not about that, and I don't think that weight should be put on them. But I do think there's actually lots of really exciting young circular economy companies sprouting up all over Scotland and all over the world, and especially around the Nordic countries and the Netherlands. There's some really exciting opportunities there for people who are coming out and thinking about what they should do with their lives to set up really innovative businesses on circular economy principles that would give them an amazing chance to do something really exciting and impactful and meaningful with their lives. So I think it's also about saying, it's not about putting the weight onto them or the pressure, but it's saying, actually, there's lots of really exciting things you could do if you just think outside the box that we're all currently in, put your head above the parapet, and you might see there are other ways of doing things that are actually much better for the planet and much better for other people. So for me, that feels really exciting. And that's one of the reasons I think the circular economy is a great way to kind of, it's a great framework for it, because it enables you to put forward some of these ideas in a way that people hopefully can understand and run with.
Okay, so I'm keeping my eye on the time, and we are heading-ish toward the end of this conversation. And I find myself thinking about both big questions and little questions. So I'm going to try and knit them together. Mary, one of the implications of what I hear coming out of this conversation is that we need children to be curious, and our school system and our economy is soaking that curiosity out of them. So if we are trying to get children to attain to preset goals, then you work toward those goals. That doesn't that doesn't encourage curiosity. And it's the grown-ups who are overseeing that system. So how do you think we encourage more curiosity? And lots of people would know that I would ask that because I talk about fierce curiosity. How do we encourage curiosity about things that make us uncomfortable? And the idea that we, the grown-ups, are creating and sustaining this system that, undermines our whole capacity for life on the planet is uncomfortable. So lots of people would hide from that. So how do we encourage curiosity, which is also a way of asking, what kind of help do you need from people?
That's two big questions. Two big questions. How do we encourage curiosity? I do think that the Curriculum for Excellence is really good at doing this. My husband is French, and so we have lots of family in the French school system, which is much more traditional and much more around testing and valuing those children in the way that we talked about just now. And I do think that the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence is good at encouraging skills like curiosity, like sort of higher order skills that go across everything they learn. So I think that's a big plus, that is definitely something that's already happening. I think it's also down to, it is that thing about lifting your head up and seeing what's around you. And that was one of the lovely things that came out of the exhibition we did during lockdown and Build Back Better, was saying to children, what do you see out there that's right there in the middle of this really bad, really difficult situation? Where's the good? And they came back with so many answers, and that was lovely because all you heard at that point was bad news. And I think it's about encouraging not just children, everyone, to see where is the good, what's the beautiful thing you've seen today. Maybe find one beautiful thing you've seen today and talk about it. And it can be, funny. It doesn't have to be something too sentimental, but I do think that going out in nature and seeing what's around you, and that can be nature in the middle of a city, is one of those ways that you can encourage curiosity and what's behind that. And we would love to do more around actually linking in with outdoor learning, because I do think it's the way that you get people kind of thinking and excited about these things. In terms of the help we need, that could be a very long answer. Really, we just want to do more of this because we do think the feedback that we've had from children, from teachers, from other organisations that we work with is this is what's needed, and it's doing it well, and it's doing what we want it to do, which is opening children up to the big idea of the circular economy and then equipping them with skills to get there. What we really want is to be able to do more of it, to get into more schools, but we have to raise funds each year to run the workshops that we do, so we're constantly working hard to try and raise that money, and that's the bit that for us is difficult. I mean, in an ideal world, we would love the Scottish Government to come in and say, we love what you're doing, here's a small amount of funding, go away and do it, because we know that we can do it and we can do it well and we can run a tight budget. So I think for us, that's the kind of the biggest challenge, is actually just funding this to happen. And the other challenge is not being able to plan more than a year ahead because of that. So you can't sort of say, right, let's do a 5-year plan where we want to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that for us is the big challenge. And at the beginning, the challenge was finding schools to do it. But I have to say now it's great because we get schools coming to us and saying, can we be part of it, which is really nice. And we're looking next year, and we're halfway through raising the funds for it just now, but at doing a series of workshops, which hopefully will be in schools, but could also be delivered online. And we send out the materials in advance if needed. And then co-creating with those schools a guide for how to cut out waste in schools. So we work with the children, with the teachers, with the schools. And actually, David, this slightly came out of the creative conversation that we had about how can you embed sustainability right through the schools. So from what the children do, to the parents, to the teachers, to the council, because so many decisions are made in different places. How could you bring all that together and come up with a guide that would help? If you were at school, you could just say, right, let's start cutting out plastic in packed lunches, for example. So we're going to work with 20 schools next year to come up with this guide, and they'll be feeding into it. And then that guide can be shared out with schools all over Scotland, so that hopefully people just have a place to start, because I think that's the thing, isn't it? Just taking the first step. And I think the other thing that's really exciting is in the schools that we've worked with, you really see like children can really run with this. So I think it's a great kind of way for young people to be learning about it, is actually to be doing it in their own schools. So give them the job of setting up a school uniform library or a toy library or some sort of sharing system. They will run with it, and in the act of doing that, they'll be learning so much as they go.
Mary, this brings together so many things. I mean, one of the themes that came out from an earlier conversation we did with Tim Brighouse and Mick Waters was about being in an era of accountability and managerialism and needing to move to an era of trust in terms of education. You're talking about that. You're talking about giving young people a sense of being empowered, which addresses a lot of the issues we've tried to touch on around young people's mental health and well-being. You've talked a lot about connections between ideas, but also partnerships. And perhaps when I finally get to your last question, you can maybe mention some of the fruitful possibilities for partnership. You've done so much and linked so many of the things that we've talked about and want to talk about, but just trying to bring it all together with our final question. What is it that you want education policymakers, not just in Scotland, but across the UK and beyond, schools and teachers, to do with these ideas that we've discussed today? And if you want to sweep up a few partnership recommendations on that,
Thanks.
God bless you. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. I would say embrace and embed the ideas. So be open to them, and then try and embed them right across your school. So we worked with one school where we did a brilliant workshop with them, but then the next week they were doing a business workshop, and the only thing they were being judged on was how much profit they were going to make. So you think there's no point doing this in a little silo over by itself. You've got to say, this is what we do, and we want to get it right across everything we do. And that's a huge process. So the other thing I would say is, don't be scared of starting. Nobody's going to walk in and suddenly have a sustainable school. It's going to be lots and lots and lots of little steps. So I think it's also about seeing the big picture, but taking small steps to get there. So knowing where you want to get to and saying, right, we want our school to be as sustainable as we can. And we want our young people and our teachers to feed into this, to be doing it themselves. Because I think you just used the word empowered, David, and I think that's exactly it. I think having the knowledge and the skills is empowering, and it totally negates that climate anxiety or paralysis that we talked about earlier. It gives people the feeling that they can actually have an impact, and they would actually be having an impact in doing these things. But once you've thought big, seen the big picture, take small steps to get there, and don't worry if it's tiny steps. That's what's needed at the beginning. But the more you take, the easier it gets. And I would say just let children run with it, because the best thing is they do come up with brilliant ideas, and also they're not scared to say if an idea is rubbish. So I might come up with a nice worthy idea and they'll be like, nah, that's not happening. That's great. You want that to happen. So I would, think big and start small.
And don't be scared of starting. I think that is a key insight that I have taken away from today. Mary Michel, it has been fantastic to have you with us, and we hope that there are all sorts of energetic people out there now ready to act on the ideas you've given us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both. And if there are any schools or teachers or partners who would like to work with us, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
If you would like to engage further with Mary's work, please visit the Ostrero website, and that's at ostrero.com. There's also an excellent article on the Craft Scotland website, which you can find on craftscotland.org. And you may want to follow up on Mary's enthusiasm for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and that's at ellenmacarthurfoundation.org. Thanks for being with us.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.